So I will be talking more about a direction of travel than any specific developments at this stage, but it's important for you guys to know where we as a company are heading. I am, and let's make sure when I press that button, it goes in the right thing. I'm Tom Crocker. I'm the Global Business Development Manager for News Workflow at Ross Video. Now, I've only been in this role for about 2.5 months, and Geordie was looking through some videos that I'd done previously under the auspices of a previous employer, and it's important I add that information to add some weight to what I'm about to say at the moment. Over my time at various previous companies, I've looked after NLEs, MAMs, PAMs, NRCSs, and significantly cameras, and I spent a long time at one of the major camera vendors as the European technical lead for remote camera workflows. And there we were, and I was spending a lot of time working with customers developing particularly news, but occasionally other types of production workflows where obviously we were looking at streaming as an integrated component of a camera and how the connectivity would work, and the also file upload based workflows, but fundamentally media contribution workflows. And over 5 or 6 years, I came up with a number of nice workflows that were tested with a number of customers, but there was a second row of questions, and this is where I'm starting to bring Ross's direction into this, is what do we do beyond media transmission? There are a lot of opportunities in this kind of workflow where you talk about remote connected devices beyond simply what you do with media. So then particularly things like metadata and configuration of the devices that you're working with, be they cameras or be they phones or some other kind of device that's a component of a media workflow that could potentially be arranged, orchestrated, controlled from elsewhere. Other pieces of useful information can also be extracted from these devices. So, and most of the time I'm going to be talking largely within the context of remote news gathering workflows, but this can apply to other stuff as well. But aspects of the device, like where it is and who's currently using it, what it's being used for, how often it's being used. This stuff can tie into things like resource allocation. How many cameras do you need in a given day? Where are they going? How are they distributed? All this kind of stuff is quite significant. You then have what happens when discussions. And the what happens when discussions come into when you try and take the concept of a widely distributed and increasingly large number of acquisition devices pumping media into a central location. So what happens when you open the floodgates to a load of, for example, user submitted files coming in over 5G incredibly rapidly from, for example, a breaking story, and you then have a single content entry point into your production system, and you end up with 10,000 files with a similar timestamp from unknown sources, all called mov0026.mov. That kind of management becomes a challenge. And that's sort of where we start to talk about Ross's interest in this process and why we're paying a great deal of attention to what you guys are talking about. Here's the little logo piece that I borrowed from the 5G Mag group. And there's some nice blue lines and some objects, and we've got a tower and a truck. And the bit that we're interested in is what happens in the middle here. What happens station side when all of this stuff is coming in and the manner of its arrival is being discussed in these groups. We at Ross, to have a little marketing-y bit, make a lot of stuff that sits in the middle there, amongst them NRCSs, MAMs and PAMs, ingest, play out, and some of the very particularly interesting ones for this is automation in the form of overdrive. And we also have a remote production system called Interstellar, which was launched during the pandemic and is a broadcast capable mechanism of bringing in feeds from, for example, laptop cameras with features that you would expect from a remote studio, at least moving in that direction. So we have a lot invested in understanding how this stuff works. So the big question for my part, and particularly with my background, is in a world of over the tipping point connectivity, how does the workflow change for the rest of the production chain? And there, over the tipping point is where bandwidth is significantly and reliably greater than the acquisition bit rate and connections are almost always on. This is going to have a lot of interesting impacts on things. And one of the first questions I've asked myself there is, what are we doing at the moment that's actually a workaround? And over the years, we've adopted several ways of working, which we sort of often think are the way or a way, but don't necessarily have to be in the coming 5-10 years. I'm not assuming that this is stuff that can be universally adopted tomorrow, but it is stuff that we need to start thinking about. So, for example, proxy workflows in particular, a lot of file-based remote submission workflows are based on proxy, and that's traditionally been because they can be moved slightly faster. But is that necessarily the case? Some streaming. We stream because we have a requirement for immediacy, and for sports and for actual live breaking news, of course, that's very important. But there are large sections of the market where particularly the idea of a chunked growing file being sent from a camera to a destination is potentially far more useful, and the reliability of the picture quality, the ability to carry source metadata with it, can lead to a more convincing and useful workflow. Issues around metadata entry, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. One of the main hallmarks of a professional production is that there is planning around it. That in a news workflow will generally exist in the NRCS, but in almost anything there will be some kind of shooting plan, and that information will generally need to be married with the incoming footage at some point during that workflow. In the context of a connected device, is there a cleverer way to link these things together and to bring the camera into that workflow earlier on, and bring the metadata rather into that workflow earlier on? Do we at some point in some shining upland future regard a cloud recording or a cloud reception of an uploaded chunked source file as the master? And does the media in the camera simply become a backup? This might be a long way into the future, but it's certainly a way to consider in terms of how one would design an effective workflow. So what does the new in-station workflow look like? Let me see, and my slide is not progressing. There we go. So one thing I touched on earlier is media flow. If you have a proliferation of sources, where do these sources go? And do we then, for example, need to start thinking about how we route files through a broadcast production in the way we might route a feed or a stream? Does that become, is there some kind of file-based routing that needs to occur as these things come in? Like I said about metadata, can we bring that in earlier, and can we potentially trigger workflows based on metadata that a file currently wouldn't carry but might in the future? Likewise, configuration. Is that something that we can, link to my last point there, automate? Should the task that a device is out attempting to achieve, given a wide enough bidirectional pipe, be something that we can control station side and potentially automate? As well, there's the application of standards. I spent a long time working with the DPP on one particular standard called News MLG2. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. And how can a body of work that came out with that standard be realized in practice when you have a proliferation of tools within a workflow where it's going to be borderline impossible to make sure that every device on that can conform with that standard? But might there be the possibility, given this type of connectivity, to link everything together in such a way that, for example, a file that was generated on a device that didn't support that kind of standard be updated to that standard before any other system needed to interact with it? Is that something that's possible here? So there are some of the opportunities that we have here. Where can or should we automate? We have our system overdrive that can automate pretty much anything, but how do we do that at scale in this world? How do we do that over wireless bridging to different devices? Is it desirable to? What can we automate that takes away busy work from people who should be doing other things? So can we take workflow procedural tasks away from journalists, for example, and allow them to focus on what they should be. How can the workflow be better connected? What remote parts of the workflow in terms of not only camera devices and acquisition, as I've mentioned, but information that a journalist has in terms of perhaps an app from the NRCS, etc., be integrated into the rest of the workflow and kept up to date in order to make sure that these inputs are more accurate and more effective. How do we come out of this with fewer exception workflows? Already the proliferation of devices means that the proliferation of codecs and inputs into a system become more and more variable. How can we bring that number back down and make sure that nobody is spending their time shepherding a given file or a given resource through a system because some part of that exists as an exception to the rest of the workflow? And then, of course, I used the 5G mag image earlier of a station on the ground, but of course we also have the simultaneous cloud transition well underway as it is, happening at the same time, and particularly how the tools that we generate can leverage the 5G infrastructure in a way that allows access to the central production tools from remote locations, rather than just from the concept of media submission to that ecosystem. And of course, what are all the standards for this? And that's largely what I'm hoping you guys will be able to tell me, or what we'll be able to learn through working with you guys on what these standards are moving towards and how we can provide the tools to do that in the best possible way. And that's 13 minutes of me talking, and I hadn't intended to take up too much. So I think that's basically it from me. I hope that was at least an interesting insight into direction of travel and some of the thinking that we're having.